New Zealand's gang underworld is a battleground. Blood has been spilled in the streets, lives have been lost in ways too gruesome to forget. Murders, drug empires, and violent rivalries have left scars that can never fade. For decades, these gangs have ruled with fear. They built networks, trafficked millions in narcotics, and silenced anyone who stood in their way. Some terrorized entire cities. Others turned prison yards into their own kingdoms. Today, we uncover the 5 most dangerous gang members to ever walk these streets. Men whose crimes changed New Zealand forever, each one more ruthless than the last. And when we reach number 1, you'll see why some names are never forgotten. New Zealand's gang culture is not a thing of the past. It has thrived in the shadows. It has spread through generations, and it has left behind a history soaked in crime, blood, and fear. For decades, names like the Mongrel Mob, the Headhunters, and the Comancheros have carried a weight that few dare to challenge. These are not street-level criminals, they are organizations. Some operate from prison cells. Others control entire neighborhoods. They do not make threats, they send messages. And when they strike, the consequences are felt far beyond the streets where it happens. But among them, there are figures who stand out. Men whose names have been written into police reports, court documents, and the memories of their victims. Some led with violence. Some built empires. Others destroyed lives without a second thought. This list ranks the 5 most dangerous gang members ever recorded in New Zealand. Each of them left their mark in ways that cannot be erased. We will start with number 5 and work our way to the most dangerous of all, and by the end of this video, you will understand why their names will never be forgotten. Some crimes are so disturbing, so inhuman, that they leave scars not only on the victims' families, but on an entire nation. The name Sam T. Hay is one that people in New Zealand will never forget. His crime wasn't an act of impulse. It wasn't a moment of rage. It was deliberate, it was calculated, and it was merciless. Sam T. Hay was a member of the Mongrel Mob, one of the most feared gangs in New Zealand. A group known for violence, for dominance, for brutal enforcement of their own twisted code. But no act of gang loyalty could ever justify what happened on the night of June 18, 1987. Colleen Burrows was only 16 years old. She had her entire life ahead of her, but on that night her path crossed with Sam T. Hay and other members of the Mongrel Mob. She was taken against her will to a gang pad in Napier. What happened next was a crime so horrifying, so cruel, that it shattered an entire community. She was beaten, she was brutalized, and she was murdered. Her body was left on a riverbank, discarded like she was nothing more than an object. Her last moments were filled with terror. And for what? A show of power? A test of loyalty? Or the pleasure of inflicting pain? The details of what she suffered are too disturbing to describe in full, but those who saw the crime scene, those who heard the evidence in court, those who sat in silence as her mother, Ida Hawkins, wept, they will never forget what was done to her. Sam T. Hay was sentenced to life in prison, but for many that was not enough. Life behind bars was still a life, something Colleen would never have. And then, years later, came the news that no one expected, a decision that reopened wounds for those who had fought to keep him locked away. After serving 30 years in prison, Sam T. Hay was granted parole. His release was met with outrage. People questioned whether a man capable of such violence could ever change. Could he ever truly be reformed? Could society ever be safe with him walking free? The Sensible Sentencing Trust, a group that advocates for victims' rights, spoke out against the decision. So did Ida Hawkins, who had spent decades living with the grief of losing her daughter in such a cruel way. To her, 30 years meant nothing compared to the pain that never faded. And then, another revelation. 7 years after his original conviction, Sam T.A. committed another act of violence. This time, it was behind bars. In Auckland Men's Prison, he and his brother launched a vicious attack on another inmate, an attempted murder inside prison walls. another reminder of what he was capable of. So why was he released? What made the parole board believe he was no longer a threat? Was it time served? Was it good behavior? Or was it a mistake that could never be undone? His parole came with conditions. He was banned from associating with gang members. He was required to stay out of Hawke's Bay, the place where his crime had shattered lives. But conditions can be broken. Promises can be empty. And the fear, the anger, the sense of injustice, it never faded for those who knew what he had done. Colleen's mother never accepted it. Many New Zealanders never accepted it, because some crimes don't deserve forgiveness. Some names should never be allowed to fade away, and some men should never walk free. But while Sam Tahi's crimes were horrifying, the next name on this list brought a whole different kind of terror. There are names that define an era, names that send a message, names that even in death continue to echo through the streets they once controlled. Lester Epps was one of those names, a leader, a fighter, a man who built his reputation with force and never backed down. His story is not one of redemption, it is one of power, violence, and the brutal reality of gang warfare. In the 1980s, Wellington was a battlefield. The mongrel mob and Black Power weren't just gangs, they were armies, each one fighting for territory, for control, for survival. And in the middle of it all was Lester Epps. He wasn't a foot soldier, he wasn't someone who followed orders, he was the one giving them. As the leader of the Wellington mongrel mob chapter, he was feared by his enemies and respected by his own. But with power comes enemies. And in a world where strength is everything, one wrong move can mean the difference between life and death. On August 15, 1981, everything came to a violent end. The Tramway Hotel in Wellington, a night that started like many others. Drinks, tension, words exchanged that couldn't be taken back. But in this world, words weren't settled with arguments, they were settled with fists, with weapons, with blood. A fight broke out between Lester Epps and members of an Eastern Suburbs Rugby League club. What started inside spilled into the streets, and when the dust settled, Lester Epps was dead. His body was found near the Basin Reserve. The man who had ruled over his gang with force had been overpowered, beaten, left for dead. But the violence didn't end there. His death sent shockwaves through the underworld. The mongrel mob wanted revenge. They wanted justice, not in a courtroom, but in the way they understood. More fights, more bloodshed, more bodies. The lines between gang rivalries, community conflicts, and racial tensions had never been more clear. Maori and Pacific Island communities saw it as something bigger than one man's death. To them, it was a battle between outsiders and their people. A battle that had been building long before that night. And when the case finally made it to court, the truth was undeniable. 14 men were convicted of manslaughter. 14 men whose lives would now be changed forever because of one night of violence. But even with those convictions, the questions remained. Had justice been served? Or had Lester Epps' death set off something even worse? Some saw him as a violent man who met the fate he had always been destined for. Others saw him as a warrior who had been taken down in an unfair fight. Either way, his name became legend, his death became a symbol, and the streets of Wellington would never be the same. If you thought gang fights were deadly, wait till you hear about this next leader who built a drug empire that shook the country. There are crimes that make headlines for a week, maybe a month, and then there are crimes that change a country forever. Joseph Jr. Wieringi didn't just commit crimes, he built an empire, one that fed addiction, destroyed lives, and left entire communities in ruin. He wasn't known for street fights. He wasn't known for petty theft. His power came from something much bigger, something more dangerous. He was a leader in the mongrel mob Aotearoa chapter, but his influence stretched beyond gang patches and prison walls. He ran one of the largest methamphetamine operations in New Zealand's history, the kind of drug trade that didn't just make money, it created a crisis. By the early 2000s, meth was more than a problem in New Zealand. It was an epidemic. It tore families apart. It turned once quiet neighborhoods into battlegrounds. People went from users to dealers, from dealers to criminals, from criminals to the next statistic in an ever-growing wave of destruction. And behind it all was Joseph Jr. Wiragi. Authorities knew something had to be done, so they launched Operation Crusade, a large-scale investigation targeting the Mongol mob's drug network. They tapped phones, they tracked movements, they sent undercover agents directly into the heart of it, and in 2003 they made their move. The arrests were swift, the charges were overwhelming. Joseph Jr. Wiragi, along with other high-ranking gang members, was taken down in a raid that sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld. More than 70 charges were laid against him, ranging from meth distribution to illegal firearms possession. He wasn't some small-time dealer, he was at the top of the chain. And the weight of his crimes couldn't be ignored. But even with him behind bars, the damage had already been done. The drugs had already flooded the streets. The violence, the addiction, the broken homes, none of that disappeared the moment he was locked away. His operation had already poisoned communities, and the effects of it would last for years. For law enforcement, Operation Crusade was a victory. But for those who had lost loved ones to the drug trade, it was never going to be enough. Because putting one man in prison didn't stop the demand, it didn't erase the thousands of lives that had already been destroyed, and it didn't stop the next wave of criminals from stepping in to take his place. Joseph Jr. Wiragi remains incarcerated, but his influence hasn't completely faded. Organized crime isn't built on one person, it's a machine, and even with one piece removed, the machine keeps moving. His name is still spoken in whispers inside prison walls, his connections haven't disappeared, and even in a cell, his past crimes still hold weight. And then there was the son, a name that shouldn't have made headlines, a name that should have been nothing more than a prisoner awaiting trial, but that changed in an instant. Because while in custody at Christchurch Men's Prison, Joseph Wiragi's son did something that no one saw coming. He escaped, a high-risk inmate, a man already facing serious charges, and in a moment of chaos he was gone. Authorities launched a nationwide manhunt, and once again the name Wiragi was at the center of another criminal pursuit. Like father, like son, a legacy of crime that refused to be buried. We're now down to the last two, and if you thought running a drug empire was bad, the next name on this list went out in a hail of bullets. When gang wars explode, they don't stop with one shot. They don't end with one funeral. They create a chain reaction, a cycle of violence that drags in everyone, rivals, families, innocent bystanders. And in Auckland, one name became the spark that set everything on fire. That name was Charles Anthony Pongi. He wasn't someone who stood in the background. He wasn't the kind of man who let others do the fighting for him. He was an enforcer for the Headhunters, a gang with a reputation built on force, control, and absolute loyalty. A group that didn't believe in backing down. And when a rivalry with the rebel MC escalated, Charles Pongi was on the front lines. For years, tensions had been brewing between these two groups. Words were exchanged, territory was disputed, but in gang culture, words don't last long before bullets take their place. And on that night in Taurima Reserve, those bullets ended a life. Gunfire erupted, chaos unfolded in the darkness. By the time it was over, Charles Anthony Pongi was dead. A gang enforcer taken down in a conflict that had been waiting to explode. His body was rushed to Auckland City Hospital, but there was nothing doctors could do. His injuries were too severe. He was gone. But the war wasn't over. His death didn't bring peace. It only fueled the fire. Gang tensions in Auckland had already been on edge. This killing tipped the scale. The streets became battlegrounds, the air filled with the constant threat of retaliation. It wasn't about justice, it was about vengeance. It was about making sure that no one got away with taking out a headhunter without consequences. The police knew what was coming. They had seen it before. So when it came time for Charles Pongi's funeral, they were ready. Armed officers lined the streets. Their presence wasn't for show. It was a warning. They knew what could happen when rival gangs used funerals as an excuse to settle scores. They watched the crowd, scanning faces, searching for any sign that the violence was about to break out again. And even as the funeral procession moved through the city, arrests were made. 3 people taken in on unrelated charges. A reminder that even in mourning, the law was watching. But despite the police presence, despite the arrests, one thing was certain: Charles Pongi's death had changed everything. The conflict between the headhunters and rebel MC had entered a new phase. And in the world of gang wars, once blood is spilled, it doesn't stop there, it spreads. It calls for more. Some saw his death as the inevitable end of a violent life. Others saw it as a loss of one of the strongest enforcers the headhunters had. But no matter which side you stood on, one thing was clear. His death wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something much worse. We've reached the #1 spot, the most feared, the most powerful, the one name that stands above the rest. Power isn't always earned through brute force. Sometimes it's built through strategy, through control, through knowing when to strike and when to wait. Pasilika Naufahu didn't lead street fights. He didn't waste time with petty crimes. His power came from something much bigger: money, drugs, connections that stretched far beyond New Zealand's borders. And when he rose to the top, he didn't just become another gang leader. He became something more: the president of the Comancheros Motorcycle Club, the face of one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the country. The Comancheros were no ordinary gang. They weren't like the street-level crews fighting over patches of territory. They were international. They had networks. They had influence. And with Pasilika Naufu at the helm, they ran a drug trafficking empire worth millions. He wasn't just dealing with local criminals. He was in business with syndicates that had reach far beyond New Zealand, Australia, South America. The money flowed, the drugs poured in, and the organization thrived. But with that level of success came attention. Law enforcement had been watching, studying, waiting, and when the time came, they made their move. It was one of the biggest operations in New Zealand's history. A crackdown on the Comancheros that exposed the full scale of Naufahu's empire. Police seized luxury cars, high-end properties, over $3,700,000 in cash. But money was only part of the story. The real power was in the drugs. Methamphetamine, cocaine, the substances that had been tearing through communities, leaving destruction in their wake. And at the center of it all was Pasilika Naufahu. But taking him down wasn't as simple as making an arrest. Men like him don't go down without a fight. Legal battles followed. Lawyers argued, charges were challenged, and despite everything that had been uncovered, despite the massive operation that had dismantled his empire, one fact remained: his influence wasn't gone. Because organized crime doesn't vanish overnight. Arrests don't erase connections. Power doesn't fade that easily. Even behind bars, even under legal scrutiny, men like Pasilika Naufu still hold weight. Their names still command respect. Their reach, even from a prison cell, is still felt. So the real question isn't whether he will stay locked away. It isn't whether his criminal empire has truly fallen. The real question is what happens next. And that's the terrifying reality. These gangs don't disappear. The question is, what happens next? These men didn't operate in the shadows. Their names were known, their crimes were felt, and their actions left behind a trail that will not be forgotten. From brutal murders to drug empires, from gang rivalries to full-scale wars, they shaped New Zealand's criminal underworld in ways that changed everything. But crime doesn't end with one arrest. It doesn't stop when one leader is taken down. Because in the world of gangs, power never stays empty for long. One man falls, another takes his place, and the cycle continues. The police will keep fighting, communities will keep hoping for peace, but the reality remains. These organizations are built to survive. They adapt, they rebuild, and as long as there is money to be made, as long as there are people willing to follow, they will always find a way to rise again. Some of these men are gone, some are locked away, but their influence, their stories, their legacies, they still exist. They serve as warnings, as reminders, that beneath the surface of everyday life, there is a world where violence is currency, where loyalty is tested in blood, and where survival is never guaranteed. Who do you think was the most dangerous? Which of these names will haunt New Zealand's history the longest? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more true crime stories that go deep into the world of organized crime, hit that like button and subscribe. There's always more to uncover. Thank you for watching. Until next time.